Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Petroleum Economists' LNG to Power Forum for North America 2020. For the next session, we're going to stay with the theme of technology and innovation, but we move downstream to technologies that can enable us to decarbonize gas-fired electricity generation. We've had a lot of discussion today about the imperative for gas to be decarbonized, and we're going to look at some specific technologies. For example, carbon capture, utilization and storage. Is it a net zero panacea, a green herring that will absorb resources and money that we could better spend elsewhere, or is it really too early to say? What should be the role of carbon pricing in incentivizing coal to gas switching? An easy route to decarbonisation in the right markets. What about fugitive methane emissions and natural gas flaring? How do we tackle those? Terribly important subjects. Is it easy to run a gas-fired power station on hydrogen? Can it be adapted easily to run on hydrogen or biomethane? And what about digitalisation and the industrial Internet of Things? What are the implications for gas-fired power there? Our moderator for this session is John Mauel, who is Global Head of Energy at the law firm Norton Rose Fulbright. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and welcome to the session. Thank you, everyone, for joining. As previously discussed in the prior sessions, starting really with Alex's welcoming remarks and sprinkled throughout the day, North American LNG to Power is poised to play a major role in satisfying the growing global demand for power. However, and this is a big caveat, greenhouse gas emissions associated with the LNG to power value chain, and that includes unburned methane released upstream, all the way to CO2 released when burned, and everything in between, are being increasingly scrutinized, and dealing with them is becoming really a competitive and marketing imperative for the LNG to power industry. So this panel is going to discuss how the LNG to power industry is responding to reduce the climate impact of their activities. And I think we've got a fantastic panel. We're covering policy, engineering and technology, and the commercial aspects of decarbonizing the chain. We're going to start with, well, actually, let me go through real quickly. Melanie Kenderdine is on the panel. She's the founder of and managing principal at Energy Futures Initiative, which is a nonprofit dedicated to driving innovation in energy technology, policy, and business models. Thank you, Melanie. Don Victory will be joining. Don Victory is the chief process engineer at ExxonMobil. And during Don's career, Don has led the engineering team responsible for process design and conceptual engineering for ExxonMobil's major projects worldwide. And we'll round it off with Andrew Hedges. Andrew is a partner at Norton Rose Fulbright in the London office. He's resident in the London office. And his practice includes carbon finance, carbon offset programs, and emission reduction technologies. Andrew has also recently had an opportunity to work on one of the big globally prominent Green LNG SPAs. So Andrew is fortunate enough to be at the forefront of Green LNG. So with that, Melanie, let's kick things off with you.
Great.
How are climate change mitigation policies evolving around the world, and what are their implications for LNG to power?
What I was going to thought I would do is share a few slides, John, that will give people some context for what is going on in the world. And let me, I'm getting better at this. Okay, let me start off before I go into this with saying NOAA just released a report today that the Arctic sea loss is at record highs, sea ice loss, and that in the Arctic it is 1 to 3 degrees warmer than it was between 1982 and 2010. It's a pretty stunning report card on what's going on in the Arctic. In May of 2019, this is a pretty stunning statistic. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations reached 415 ppm, the highest level in 800,000 years. At the current rate of warming at 0.2 degrees per decade, the planet will likely reach the lower target, Paris target of 1.5 degrees by 2030. As of 2018, 2/3 of the major emitting countries in the world are not on track to meet their Paris targets. So this is a little bit, it's a report card, a website called Climate Tracker. I use it quite a bit. And I'm going to show you which countries fit into those categories. Critically insufficient. Those are countries that are well outside their fair share range of emissions reductions. And if all of those in this range were stayed in this range, warming would exceed 4 degrees. Highly insufficient. Indices are outside the country's fair share range. If all governments were in this range, warming would reach 3 to 4 degrees. Insufficient, warming would reach 2 to 3 degrees. Compatible, that's compatible with a 2-degree goal of Paris, and 1.5 degrees is compatible, 1.5 degrees compatible, you can see there. And these are the countries, a few that I'm going to be talking about today. The USA, critically insufficient. China and Japan and South Korea, highly insufficient. The EU is insufficient. India is 2 degrees compatible. So just to give people an idea where countries are in meeting their targets, the US, as you know, we pulled out of the Paris Agreement the day after Election Day. This year, I am sure that the new president will actually, President Biden will actually re-enter the Paris Agreement, but we've got a lot of catching up to do because we are critically insufficient. Since this is about the use of natural gas in power generation and LNG, I wanted to show you a little bit here. These are regional CO2 savings from coal to gas fuel switching between 2010 and 2018. The US there is the big turquoise color, China darker blue, Europe light green, India dark green, and the rest of the world is yellow. And this is just for 2018. The reductions in CO2 emissions by switching from coal to gas were about 4% of the world's total. 14% of the US total were emissions reductions from switching from coal to gas. In China, that number is 8%. So a switch from coal to gas has given them an 8% reduction. And then here we forget about criteria pollutant emissions. And I just wanted to give people some perspective. Criteria pollutants, we have the Clean Air Act in the United States. Go to New Delhi, go to other places in the world. Criteria pollutants are hugely problematic. And I just wanted to give you some perspective. Those are SOx, NOx, and particulates you see there. And SOx, natural gas, is 0.7% of the global total in 2019, 10% of NOx, and 4% of particulates. So you get much cleaner, air with natural gas than you do with coal, oil, or bioenergy. Very briefly, talk about the megawatts of coal capacity under construction in 2018. And this is just, I'm just going to focus on 2 countries. This is 2018, and these are projects under construction, not announced projects. Everyone on this call and knows announced projects don't always go through. These are under construction. In India and China alone, 2 countries, 165,000 megawatts of coal generation under construction. And if you put that in perspective, the US had a total of about 235,000 megawatts of installed coal capacity in 2018. And that's just to give you some idea. Then the National Energy Technology Lab did a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for natural gas and coal in Asia, and it looked at different sources of LNG. Different sources of LNG have different emissions, and US is one of the lower ones there. And you can see here, and it's a 100-year GWP and a 20-year global warming potential. And there for 100-year GWP, if you replaced the coal generation in China with LNG from the US, you would get a 37% reduction in emissions from power generation. If you did this, that's a 100-year GWP. With a 20-year GWP, you would get a 29% reduction in CO2 emissions. And just a couple other things. I looked at the numbers on US LNG exports. I was at the Department of Energy for the second Obama term. We issued the first, Secretary Moniz, who's one of my partners in business, issued the first permit for LNG exports from the US. The number one customer is Europe at 39% of our LNG in 2019. Number two is Asia, right behind at 37%. Number three is Central and South America at 19%. Number four is the Middle East at 3.5%. And then the Caribbean gets about 1% of our LNG. And so when I look at the numbers and greenhouse gas emissions, coal generation in those different regions, and you can see the differences, it makes a big difference in some regions of the world, that if you switch from coal to gas and you are using US LNG to do so. And then one more thing I would say, just switching gears finally before shutting up, I would look at water use. Okay, I've shown you the particulates and the criteria pollutant emissions, the reductions you can get of CO2 emissions from LNG and US LNG in particular. But water use is very, very important in some parts of the world, the Middle East, the Mediterranean ring, and where I am in New Mexico and the southwestern United States, where water is scarce. Switching from coal-fired power plants in the US to natural gas, your annual water savings would be 12,250 billion gallons of water. That's 260% of our current annual industrial use of water. So you get cleaner air, lower CO2 emissions, and you use less water. But what I would finally say, John mentioned methane emissions, that methane emissions are highly problematic. There are things that we can do to do emissions reductions, methane emissions reductions starting at the wellhead. We had methane regulations in the Obama administration. The Trump administration overturned those regulations, so we are not regulating methane, and that's something we need to be looking at again. And then if you move to LNG ships, you can a lot lower emissions from those as well. So I think we need a wellhead to shipping emissions, methane emissions reductions. So thank you.
Melanie, thanks. Given that landscape, and you're pointing out the methane issues in the U.S. from a policy standpoint, and mitigation policies in Europe, do you foresee eventually the EU restricting or regulating or requiring reporting on greenhouse gas emissions for LNG imports into the EU all the way down the value chain? So for example, coming all the way and reaching into the US upstream methane emissions.
Thank you, and it's not right now. Global supply chains are included in no one's nationally determined contributions, but the European Union is developing a carbon border tax policy. They are supposed to issue a proposal on that by mid 2021, and a border adjustment is meant to protect carbon-intensive domestic industries in the EU from foreign competitors that do not put a price or some penalized carbon. And so if Europe puts a border adjustment levy on imports, that will have a significant effect. I can't tell you precisely how, but will have a significant effect on U.S. LNG. I mentioned earlier that 39% of our LNG exports go to the EU or to Europe, not just the EU. And so it could create trade problems. I think you could alleviate those trade problems if we go back to regulating methane emissions in the United States, as we did in the Obama administration, and start thinking about LNG ships, quite frankly, and lowering the emissions from shipping. And so I think it's going to take time for the EU to design its border tax. It's carbon border tax, and we will see how that comes out. It had potential in the Trump administration to raise a lot of tensions in trade between the US and the EU. My gut is that the Biden administration will do more in that regard, and it will make it less problematic from a trade perspective. The one thing I would say about border adjustment, and I have worries about this myself, is that it penalizes the least developed countries. And, you know, natural gas from Mozambique, natural gas from Senegal, huge gas finds offshore Senegal. The border adjustments will be problematic for the least developed countries and their export products. So it's something that we need to be mindful of as we are thinking about those issues.
Thank you, Melanie. And I think that puts a real fine point on engineering and technology, and what's under the development to decarbonize the chain. So I think that brings us to your area, Don. Can you walk us through the LNG to power value chain and give us a breakdown of the range of CO2 equivalent emitted at each one of the stages? So like upstream, liquefaction, shipping, and power, and then also then follow it up with a high level description. And I'm sure you could talk forever, but a very, very high level description of the various technologies under development to decarbonize at each one of those links in the chain.
Sure. And I'm going to refer to data that WoodMac has published. So if you look at the upstream, you see data from WoodMac that in one reference says that the upstream emissions of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide equivalent from Middle East LNG is 4%, US is 8%. But if you actually think about it in terms of best available technology, it could be as low as 0%. So there's a few things that are going on there. One is some maybe underappreciated design aspects in the past that you wouldn't do again, like using gas-powered pneumatic instruments that you can replace with instrument air or electricity. So some of those changes are going on. Some of it is just practices, but if you think about it, if you look at, for example, the Gorgon development, where ExxonMobil is 25% interest, that has a subsea upstream, and we're not leaking methane into the ocean. It's all buttoned up, and it all comes inside the plant fence. And if you look at the developments in Mozambique, they're all proposed to be that way too. So there's a lot of things that we can do in how we design and go about our business that just makes sense and gets and in some areas we're pushing forward in that place regardless of the lack of regulation, because it's a good thing to do. So I'll come back and touch on that a little bit later. So upstream 0 to 8%, we should be pushing down to 0%. In the US you can get down to residual gas compression fuel going cross state as you get to LNG plants, for example, maybe a few percent. If you actually look at the LNG plant itself, it's kind of interesting that you see going on in the marketplace. If you were to look at the traditional simple cycle gas turbine drive LNG plants, That might give you a fuel consumption of somewhere around 8 or 10% of the inlet fuel, a CO2 equivalent ton of CO2 produced per LNG of somewhere in the 0.25, 0.3 range. But as you look at some plants that are coming into existence now with combined cycles, you see that number pushing down to somewhere between like 0.18 or to 0.22 or so. So maybe about a little bit less than 7% of the inlet fuel. So just by better design and efficiency, and there's not data saying that when you build these plants, they actually cost more to build. We're learning how to build them both more efficiently in their process efficiently, and also delivering them at more efficient cost. Then you do see some plants taking advantage of renewable energy. Snowbit was a plant that did that using power for the balance of plant while they had gas turbine compressors driving refrigeration. LNG Canada is being built in that regard, and British Columbia set a target of 0.16 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of LNG that they're trying to reach there in British Columbia. But even in the US, you're seeing some of the plants that are electric powered reaching numbers that are maybe a third, or even one is proposed that it would be 2/3 of that. And so you're starting to see an interesting thing in the literature where you're starting to see people kind of comparing, not just, they're comparing the CO2 intensity of their LNG as it goes to the marketplace. So these are all technical possibilities. So energy efficiency, looking at how to make the cycle more efficient, and then and so I'll talk about new technology there in a minute to maybe even get lower even for the existing plants. Then you get into the shipping, depending on the shipping routes. If you look at shipping from like the US to Europe or Middle East to Asia, that might consume about 4% of this, or emit 4% of the CO2 in the chain. But if you go in US to China, for example, you might get up more 5, 6, 7, 8% of the fuel of the CO2 emitted in the carbon chain. So in the big picture, 0 to 8% in the upstream, about 6 to 10% in the liquefaction, single digit to 8% or so in the transportation, and then about 75 to 85% is in the actual end use. Melanie has already talked about if you're substituting LNG and gas for coal power, you're taking a substantial chunk out of the total carbon emissions. So as they taught us in the first week of chemical engineering school, in minus out equals accumulation. So burning LNG in those applications rather than coal is a great way to start saving on the carbon budget. So is that good for the overview before I talk about the technology?
Yeah, absolutely. Unless anyone else has any questions. That sounds great, Don, please.
Okay, so let's try to go through the value chain and talk about savings. And I'll start with the big chunk on the back end first. So the approaches that are widely recognized there are post carbon capture and combustion carbon capture, post combustion carbon capture and pre combustion carbon capture, and scrubbing CO2 out of the stacks of power plants is an established technology, but getting the right business case and commercial and policy support is usually the key to make that go. There was a coal plant here in Texas, just a few miles from my house in Sugar Land, where they actually put CO2 capture, and we're using that CO2 for EOR. And you also see it on the power side. So post combustion capture is established technology, but not necessarily cost effective. That runs about $100 or so a ton of CO2 to put away, and that order of magnitude. Another option is changing the energy driver. So using so you could possibly switch to hydrogen as a fuel, be it the various colors of hydrogen, or you could also make ammonia, and we did see a shipment of ammonia go to Japan, and so ammonia could be a potential power fuel for end use with carbon capture on the producer side. So in the near term, we're seeing, you know, the best thing for the carbon budget is to do the coal to natural gas switching, and then over time, as policy support probably firms up, we'll see more of those other type of solutions. On the shipping, traditionally we use heavy fuel oil and possibly diesel in shipping. One study I saw said that from a wells to wake, so taking natural gas and turning it into the propeller of the ship, that you can see 14 to 21% CO2 equivalent life cycle reduction by switching from heavy fuel oil to LNG powered ships. And right now there's only a couple hundred ships that are LNG powered, a couple hundred more, I think Melanie told me, that are on order, but there's a large market opportunity to get those converted. So again, saving 14 to 21% life cycle. And if you actually look at it at a ship only basis, you can reduce the footprint of each ship by 30%. The rest of the emissions are leakages that might be occurring in the system, which I'll talk about how we attack that in a minute. On Melanie, you have a question? Comment? Okay. If you look at the LNG plants, I already mentioned the standard suite of energy efficiency, going combined cycle. You know, I would think just simple cycle plants in the future, we won't see that that we need to get more use out of every unit of energies, and since we're finding ways to build that without a capital cost penalty, we'll probably see more combined cycle plants in the future. And that will get us down to carbon intensity, ignoring the CO2 that might be in the inlet gas of somewhere around 0.18, 0.9 ton of CO2 equivalent per ton of LNG. Beyond that, the LNG plant is basically a big power plant that happens to use its power internally. So we'll see some of the same strategies there as we're seeing on the power generation side. You'll see evaluation of post-combustion capture. We already saw one U.S. Gulf Coast proposed LNG plant say that they're pursuing options to do post-combustion capture. So these ideas are actively being studied in the marketplace. Another one that's out there is actually hydrogen for fuel within LNG plants. That we are definitely seeing the turbine manufacturers and the power industry going forward. There's a project proposed in Utah to use hydrogen for power plants, starting up on 30% hydrogen by fuel mix and then increasing to 100% over the decades is what's proposed. Another one in Ohio. So all the turbine manufacturers can accept a range of hydrogen as fuel, 20, 30%, up to 50%. Some turbine manufacturers have designs and even some actual units for offer that are up to 100%. So if we can make hydrogen economically, it will cost an uplift. There will have to be policy support in order to do that. But if the market exists, there are ways to reduce the emissions of LNG plants with regard to their combustion fuels. And on the upstream side, so Melanie talked about regulation, but we don't necessarily have to wait for regulation. Earlier this year, ExxonMobil released a framework for methane monitoring and mitigation, and it includes transparency, it includes using technology. We started a project that is evaluating 8 different technologies for finding methane leaks, and we're making that information available to the industry. So if you find it, you can fix it. And these includes various ways of aerial detection, airplane, sensors from airplanes, helicopters, drones. It also includes satellite imagery. We've engaged some other parties to help us with regional air monitoring to determine the regional balance. And then we have truck mounted and various sorts of handheld scanners that we can go do verify. So if you set your mind to going about and reducing these leaks, which you may not have appreciated in the past, you can go a long way. We're on target to reduce our emissions in the Permian in our unconventional portfolio, 20% 2016 through the end of 2020. And worldwide, we're reducing them 15% on methane emissions and 25% on flaring. So there's a range of high-tech, low-tech, fixing little leaks and things like that that are all available in the toolkit, and just have to get after it.
That's very helpful, Don. Andrew, before moving to you, I just have a quick question for Don. And it strikes me as you walk through the value chain that eventually, from a contractual risk standpoint, from the point of view of, say, a US LNG seller selling DAT, if that seller is trying to back emissions obligations along the value chain, there's going to be a need to be able to have some sort of standards to measure and quantify those emissions, the shipping and the liquefaction and the upstream. Have those standards become uniform? I know that you've gone through these range, but is there a widely accepted metric for determining what the carbon equivalent emissions are upstream, liquefaction, shipping?
I think Andrew may be more qualified on this. I
Okay.
think they're emerging. I'm not sure they are, but even when I kind of look at some of the published reports on CO2 emissions for various plants that are out there, and I'm noticing there's a difference between kind of maximum permitted amount and what the expected amount is. So how you do that accounting is, I think people are starting to wake up to that there's need to have standards and transparencies. And when I look at some of the plants and when other people are saying their emissions are X, they're kind of going, no, they're not, but they really didn't appreciate the sensitivity that it's going to be important to understand your emissions, be able to document it, and have standards and probably even third-party certifications. And then how that plays out commercially, it's going to be important. So that maybe at that point, I'll pass it over to Andrew.
Well, actually, Melanie, I think wanted to make a quick point.
Yeah, I wanted to say on that we do need to standardize the accounting and the measurements. It's not standardized, and I have been thinking about, here in the US, we have an Energy Star program, and you get an Energy Star for being a highly efficient building. And rather than use sticks on something like that, doing carrots, okay, where you get the equivalent of an Energy Star for your emissions reductions in your LNG supply chain, I think would be, and just your gas supply chain, not necessarily LNG, but starting with the upstream, doing an Energy Star-like program would be very valuable. The Department of Energy does the standardization of measurements and accounting for Energy Star, so it would have to get involved in something like that. But I think that could be a very valuable thing for gas production and distribution and shipping in general.
That makes sense, Melanie. So with that, I think that's a good segue, Andrew, to turn to you for an overview, of how LNG players are developing commercial options. And I'm sure it's a broad subject for mitigating the carbon footprint. But can you just start very with the basics? Can you explain exactly what is green LNG and how offsetting works?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And hi, everyone. It's actually fantastic that we're having this conversation today. To think that we are getting to the nitty-gritty of how we're going to do this, how we're going to work out the footprint, what are the technology options, what are the commercial solutions, just shows that we're serious about what we're doing as a sector going into the 2020s. I will answer your question, John. Just quickly though, the Pavilion deal that we were involved with and was taken forward this year, they recognized first and foremost, before you can talk about offsetting, before you can talk about pure green LNG play, you've got to understand the footprint. You've got to understand exactly what you guys are talking about. And yes, there are standards. There's the API compendiums, IPCA, there's various reports, and there's very experienced consultants out there. Woodmac was mentioned and others. But the real interesting thing is, how do you actually apply that in practice for the supply chain for a long-term LNG, from X loading port through to this discharge port? what does it actually look like in practice? Do you have access to the right data? Do you have to rely on proxies like secondary data? So, and I think what will come out through that, the first supplier with Qatar Petroleum, they've been signed up, more to come. But the process of actually developing methodology, of turning concepts into actions, will show not only that it's doable, but hopefully will trigger exactly what Melanie and Don are talking about, and that, you know, the ecosystem of the sector will respond and say, okay, this is real. We can solve for this. We can produce this data. We can produce this intensity figure, and we can do it effectively and efficiently. But hasn't answered your question, John. So what is green LNG? No, I don't know if anyone would actually say there is a clear understanding. Most people would use it nowadays as almost a framework to say where you are selling an LNG product, where you are making some complete or partial commitment to having offset the carbon emissions associated with that supply. Now, there's been a few cargo-based deals over the last couple of years. Those have had different approaches. Some have talked about offsetting the full, both supply chain and use. Others have just talked about offsetting the use, the combustion. But in each case, they're talking about offsets. And for those who are not as deeply involved in the emission sector, some of us have been for 10 plus years, offsets are effectively referring to emission reductions that have been achieved by a project under a verifiable and robust standard that says, I've prevented emissions that would have otherwise gone into the atmosphere. I've protected that forest. I've planted those trees. I've built that wind farm that would have not otherwise been built. So when people talk about green LNG with offsets, it's not necessarily immediately talking about creating emission savings within a supply chain. It could be like some of the deals that Shell and others have done. The actual offsets come from nature-based solutions. Now, in a pure carbon accounting sense, there's no problem with that. But I guess I would say that the interesting thing for us as a sector when we talk about green LNG play is, yes, it's an important thing commercially to develop in the hope that customers will want to pay that extra for a green LNG product. But the wider question, backing up to what Melanie was saying about Europe's approach to LNG, and does it put on border tariffs and all those types of things, you need to start talking about LNG's commitment to addressing emissions if it does become your social license to export and to enter into markets. And when you start talking in that context, I think that we have to talk about what does this incentivize within the supply chains themselves, going back to Don's points, because I don't think necessarily Europe would accept someone saying my LNG is fully offset against nature-based solutions as really a full answer to their concerns. I think they would want to see the sector saying green LNG is not just offsets. Green LNG, when we talk about neutrality, is about what are you doing to reduce your emissions yourself, and then yes, maybe there are offsets on the residual. And I think the $1 million question there is, as Don was saying, on some of those technology solutions, they're pretty expensive. Hydrogen is expensive. CCS is expensive. So this is the green LNG, I think, is coming. Initially, it will be driving a lot of fantastic and important work on how do you calculate the footprint. It will then drive some really interesting deals around offsets, probably from cheaper offset solutions like nature-based solutions. But then I think as some of the leading players who are seeing this as like an opportunity to show what they can achieve, what they can do, and Don's already flagged that, you know, a lot is happening, whether there's a commercial incentive or not. People in the sector see this as a natural moral responsibility for the 2020s. They will start saying, okay, I'm now got a green LNG deal. How do commercially I put it together so that I'm creating the emission savings, I'm creating the offsets within my own supply chain, which will achieve those technology solutions we hope for. I'll pause there. I saw that we were got a minute left, so maybe one last question.
Well, what would be near and dear to my heart is even where we are today, Andrew, and I'm still a little unclear when assuming that it's going to take a while before we achieve the actual technological and engineering reductions that Melanie and Don have talked about. And we're going to be using offsets for US LNG, at least in the near term. And I'm still a little unclear whether the deals to date, how it was determined how much of an offset was acceptable to the buyer and rendered it green. Was it just was it offsets relating to combustion and shipping, or shipping and liquefaction, or did they try to say this is how much reduction is needed all the way up the chain? But regardless of that, given where we are today, could a US LNG seller structure a green LNG SPA? Given the US credits market and where we are today, is that a challenge to doing that, or are the credits purchased based upon the destination country or region? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Briefly, and I should make clear, the pavilion deal we're involved in is focused predominantly on how do you tackle the footprint question, and is not necessarily answering the full offset question. Although everyone hopes that green LNG will evolve. Yes, short answer is yes. An exporter of North American LNG could develop and offer a green LNG product where they sourced offsets that they could staple with their LNG cargoes and provide buyers with some sort of solution. Now, there is offsets available in the markets today, predominantly because there's a lot of voluntary standards which have done a lot of work on projects which are creating those, and more will come. But you then get into the tricky question, which we don't have time for, of is the offset you're offering and that you've acquired at an economic price, is it the right offset that your buyer actually recognizes or wants or sees as legitimate for the purposes of a green LNG product? And that will evolve over time and get more complex as Paris Agreement is implemented and various other factors arise.
Understood. I'll tell you, this has been an incredibly informative panel for me personally. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it and found it as worthwhile as I have. I wish we had another 2 hours to talk about that. I know I'm going to follow up with each of you and continue the conversation. So thank you very much. And everyone, please join me in thanking Melanie, Don, and Andrew.